My name is Eleanor Mayfield, and I'm 68 years old. I never thought I'd find myself here sitting in a quiet room with only a camera's blinking light for company, bearing the moment my heart broke so completely I wasn't sure it could ever mend. It was last April, a Tuesday afternoon, when my daughter Caroline stood in our kitchen and said, "You're just old and bitter, Mom. You need to let go of this house and move on." Her words didn't cut like a knife. They crushed like heavy stones piling on my chest, squeezing the breath from my lungs. I stood there, hands dusted with flour from the pie crust I was shaping, in the same kitchen where I'd wiped her tears and taught her to knead dough, and I felt like a stranger in my own life. She wanted me gone out of the house my late husband Thomas and I had built with every dream and dollar we'd scraped together. This wasn't just a house, it was our legacy, our love woven into every beam and brick. And now Caroline, my only child, was telling me it no longer belonged to me. To understand the weight of those words, I need to take you back. I was born in a small Ohio town raised by parents who taught me that family was the heartbeat of everything. I met Thomas at 21, married him a year later, and together we built a life simple but rich with meaning. He was a carpenter, his hands calloused yet tender, crafting tables and chairs that carried stories. I was a homemaker, though that word feels too small for the world I created. I stretched budgets, sewed curtains, planted gardens, and turned a modest plot of land into a home that felt alive with warmth. When Caroline came along, she was our miracle, a light that made every sacrifice shine. I gave her everything, my time, my hopes, my heart. Thomas and I saved for her schooling, clapped at her dance recitals, and held each other tight when she married Mark, a man whose smile seemed kind at first, but grew colder with the years. When Thomas passed 6 years ago, a piece of my soul went with him. But I carried on for Caroline, for the family we'd nurtured. Our house became my sanctuary after Thomas died. It's a 2-story with a wide, welcoming porch, painted white with black shutters, the kind of place that feels like it's wrapping you in a hug. Thomas built it from the ground up, and I was there beside him, sanding beams, picking out paint colors, planting roses that still bloom along the walkway. Every inch held a memory: the scratch on the dining table from Caroline's crayons, the creak in the stairs, where Thomas once stumbled, carrying her to bed. It was my refuge, my heart's home. But after Thomas's death, Caroline and Mark moved in, saying they wanted to take care of me. I opened my doors, hoping it would draw us closer. Instead, it pushed us apart. At first, their disregard was subtle. Mark leaving dishes in the sink, Caroline brushing off my questions about her day. But over time, it grew bolder. They'd talk over me at dinner, plan holidays, without asking, rearrange furniture I'd chosen with Thomas. My things, photo albums, his old toolbox. The quilt I'd stitched for Caroline's birth ended up in dusty attic boxes, like relics they couldn't be bothered with. When I tried to speak up, Caroline would sigh, "Mom, you're making a big deal out of nothing." Mark was harsher. He'd laugh a sharp mocking sound and say, "Eleanor, you're living in a different century." I began to feel like a ghost in my own home, shrinking to fit the corners they left me, moving quietly to avoid their irritation. That Tuesday in the kitchen was different, though. Caroline had been distant for months, her patience with me worn thin. I'd overheard her and Mark arguing about money, about the house, about how it's too much for her to manage. I didn't fully understand until that afternoon. I was rolling out dough, the familiar rhythm soothing my nerves, when Caroline stormed in. Her face was tight, her voice clipped. "Mom, we need to talk, and I mean really talk," she said. I wiped my hands on my apron, my heart already sinking, and turned to face her. She didn't sit, didn't soften. She stood there, arms crossed, and said, "This house is too big for you now. You're not yourself anymore. You're old and bitter, and it's dragging us all down. Mark and I think you should move out, maybe to a senior home. We'll handle the house from here." The room seemed to spin. My daughter, the girl I'd rocked through nightmares, was telling me to leave the home I'd built. I tried to speak to ask what I'd done wrong, but my throat closed up, words trapped behind a burning lump. All I could manage was Caroline. "This is my home." She shook her head, her eyes hard as stone. "It's our home now, Mom. You're not capable of managing it anymore. We've already looked into some places for you." Mark appeared in the doorway, leaning against the frame, nodding like they'd rehearsed every line. I looked at them, my daughter, her husband, and saw strangers wearing faces I used to know. I didn't cry, not then. I just untied my apron, folded it carefully, and walked upstairs to my room. But inside, I was collapsing. That night, I sat on my bed clutching a framed photo from our 40th anniversary. Thomas's smile, warm and steady, seemed to ask, "What do we do now, Ellie?" I had no answer. I felt small, unwanted, like a burden they couldn't wait to shed. I replayed my life, decades of love, sacrifice, quiet strength, and wondered where I'd gone wrong. Was I really just old and bitter? Had I become someone my own daughter couldn't stand? The questions clawed at me, keeping sleep far away. I thought of Thomas, of the vows we'd made in this house, and how I'd promised to honor them. I thought of Caroline as a child, her tiny hand in mine, and how I'd sworn to protect her. But who was protecting me now? I sat there for hours, the house silent around me. The walls seemed to hum with the life we'd built. Thomas's laughter, Caroline's giggles, the clink of dishes at Sunday dinners. I traced the edge of the photo frame, my fingers lingering on the glass, and felt a faint stirring inside me. It wasn't anger, not yet, but a quiet pulse of resolve. I wasn't ready to give up, not my home, not my dignity, not myself. As dawn crept through the curtains, painting the room in soft gray, I whispered to the photo, "I'm still here, Thomas. I'm still here." The words felt like a vow, though I didn't know what they meant yet. But in that moment, with the first light of day touching my face, I knew I couldn't let their words define me. Not now, not ever. The days after Caroline's words felt like walking through fog, thick, disorienting, every step, heavy with doubt. I woke each morning in my bedroom, the same room where Thomas and I had whispered dreams in the dark, but now it felt like a cage. The house, once my sanctuary, echoed with silence, broken only by the clatter of Caroline and Mark's lives downstairs. I'd hear them laughing over coffee, planning their day, their voices bright and careless, as if I didn't exist. I stayed upstairs longer than I needed, avoiding their eyes, their impatience. I told myself it was to keep the peace, but deep down I was hiding from the truth that my own daughter saw me as a burden, a relic to be packed away. At 68, I'd never felt so small, so invisible. My heart ached with a grief I couldn't name, a mix of betrayal and bewilderment. How had it come to this? How had the girl I'd raised, the one I'd loved so fiercely, turned into someone who could dismiss me with such coldness? I tried to keep busy to hold on to the routines that had always grounded me. I'd dust the furniture, water, the roses, bake bread, even though no one ate it. But every task felt hollow. I'd catch my reflection in the kitchen window, gray hair, pulled back eyes tired, and wonder who that woman was. Was Caroline right? Was I bitter old? I'd spent my life building this family, this home, and now it seemed like none of it mattered. I stopped joining them for meals, claiming I wasn't hungry. The truth was, I couldn't bear their indifference. I'd sit alone in my room eating toast, staring at Thomas's old watch on the nightstand. It didn't tick anymore, but I kept it there, a reminder of a time when I felt needed, loved. The loneliness was suffocating, but worse was the shame. I'd lie awake at night, replaying Caroline's words, searching for where I'd failed her. Had I been too soft, too strict, too much? I thought of all I'd given sleepless nights when she was sick, years of scrimping to buy her books, the way I'd cheered at her graduation, even as my heart ached for Thomas, who couldn't be there. I'd always believed love was enough, that it would bind us forever. But now I felt like a fool for believing it. I didn't tell anyone what had happened, not my sister in Cleveland, not my old friend Mary from church. How could I explain that my daughter wanted me gone? The words felt too heavy, too humiliating to speak aloud. One morning, about a week after that awful Tuesday, I couldn't stay in the house any longer. The walls seemed to close in and I needed airspace, anything to quiet the ache. I slipped on my coat, grabbed my scarf, and walked out the front door, not caring where I was going. The neighborhood was quiet, the air crisp with the last of spring's chill. I wandered past houses I'd known for decades, their porches and gardens familiar yet distant like memories from someone else's life. I ended up at the park a few blocks away, a small place with a pond and a bench, where Thomas and I used to sit. I sank onto the bench, staring at the water, and let the tears come. They weren't loud or dramatic, just silent, steady, like rain I'd held back too long. I cried for Thomas, for the life we'd built, for the daughter I didn't recognize anymore. I cried for myself, for the woman I'd lost somewhere along the way. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually I heard footsteps on the gravel path. I wiped my eyes embarrassed and looked up to see Mrs. Larson, a neighbor I'd known vaguely for years. She was in her late 70s with a kind face and a limp from an old injury. She carried a small bag of breadcrumbs for the ducks. "Eleanor, is that you?" She said, her voice warm but cautious. I nodded, forcing a smile, but she saw through it. She sat beside me, uninvited but not unwelcome, and didn't ask what was wrong. Instead, she tossed crumbs to the ducks and said, "You know, I come here when the world feels too heavy. The water doesn't judge." Her words, simple as they were, felt like a lifeline. I didn't tell her everything, but I let a little spill out how Caroline and Mark were reorganizing the house, how I felt out of place. She listened, nodding her eyes soft with understanding. "You're not alone, Eleanor," she said. "We all carry hurts we don't deserve." Mrs. Larson's kindness was a small thing, but it cracked open something in me. For the first time in days, I felt seen, not as a burden, but as a person. We talked a little longer about nothing important: ducks, spring flowers, the new bakery on Main Street. When I stood to leave, she pressed my hand and said, "Come back tomorrow. The ducks miss you." I laughed a small, rusty sound and promised I would. Walking home, I felt a flicker of something, hope maybe, or defiance. It wasn't much, but it was enough to keep me moving. Back at the house, things hadn't changed. Caroline barely looked up when I came in, and Mark was on the phone talking loudly about some business deal. But I did something different that day. Instead of retreating upstairs, I went to the attic where they'd stashed my things. The air was musty, the boxes unlabeled, but I found what I was looking for: a wooden box Thomas had made for our 25th anniversary. Inside were letters we'd written to each other, faded but precious. I sat on the attic floor reading them by the light of a single bulb and felt him with me again. His words were steady, kind, reminding me of the woman I'd been: strong, capable, loved. I held one letter to my chest, tears falling, but these were different. They weren't just grief, they were a promise to myself. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't done. The next day I went back to the park. Mrs. Larson was there as promised, and we fed the ducks again. She didn't pry, but she shared a story of her own, how her son had stopped calling after a fight years ago, how she'd learned to find joy in small things like her garden or a good book. Her resilience, quiet but fierce, stirred something in me. I started going to the park every morning, and those moments with Mrs. Larson became my anchor. I began to notice other small things, the way the roses in my garden still bloomed, the way my hands remembered how to knead dough, the way my voice sounded when I hummed Thomas's favorite song. They were tiny acts of defiance, proof I was still here, still Eleanor. One evening, I did something bold, though it felt small at the time. Caroline and Mark were out, and I went to the living room where they'd moved my old rocking chair to a corner. I dragged it back to its rightful place by the window where Thomas and I used to sit. It was heavy and my arms ached, but I did it. I sat in it, rocking gently, and felt a spark of pride. This was my home, my life, and I wasn't ready to let it go. I didn't know what lay ahead, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a quiet strength growing like a seed pushing through cracked earth. I wasn't sure where it would lead, but I knew I couldn't stay invisible forever. The weeks that followed my quiet rebellion in the living room felt like a delicate dance between holding on and letting go. Each day I woke with Caroline's words, old and bitter, echoing in my mind, but they began to lose their sharp edges, softened by the small acts of defiance I was weaving into my life. The house still felt like a battleground with Caroline and Mark's presence, a constant reminder of my displacement. Their voices carried through the walls, planning renovations, discussing budgets, laughing over wine as if I were a ghost they'd already forgotten. I'd hear them talk about modernizing the kitchen or clearing out clutter, and I knew they meant my life, my memories, the things Thomas and I had cherished. Yet in the midst of this, I was finding pieces of myself again fragile, but real like shards of a broken vase I was learning to glue back together. Mornings became my sanctuary. I'd slip out before Caroline or Mark stirred, walking to the park where Mrs. Larson and the ducks waited. Those moments by the pond, tossing crumbs and sharing quiet stories, were a balm to my bruised heart. Mrs. Larson, with her gentle wisdom, never pushed me to spill more than I was ready to share. Instead, she'd talk about her life, her late husband, her garden, the way she'd learned to live with her son's silence. "You don't stop being you just because someone else stops seeing you," she said one morning, her eyes on the water. Her words sank deep, rooting themselves in me. I began to look forward to our talks, to the way they reminded me I was more than the shadow Caroline and Mark had made me feel like. At home, I moved carefully, avoiding confrontations. Caroline barely spoke to me now, her eyes skimming past me like I was furniture. Mark was worse. His comments, once veiled, grew bolder. "Eleanor, you don't need to fuss with the garden," he'd say, smirking. "We're hiring landscapers." I'd nod, biting back the urge to remind him that those roses were mine, planted with Thomas's hands beside me. Instead, I poured my energy into small, secret acts of reclaiming. I'd sneak into the attic to retrieve more of my things, a ceramic vase Thomas had loved, a scarf I'd knitted for Caroline's 10th birthday. I'd place them quietly in my room, a private rebellion against their erasure of me. Each item felt like a stitch in the fabric of my identity, pulling me back together. One afternoon, while Caroline and Mark were out, I found myself in the garage where they'd stashed Thomas's old tools. The air was thick with dust, and the sight of his toolbox shoved behind a pile of Mark's golf clubs made my chest tighten. I knelt beside it, my fingers tracing the worn leather handle. Inside were his hammers, screwdrivers, a small carving knife he'd used to whittle toys for Caroline. I remembered him in his workshop, humming as he worked his hands steady and sure. I took the carving knife, small enough to carry, and slipped it into my pocket. Back in my room, I set it on the nightstand beside his watch. It wasn't much, but it felt like bringing a piece of him back to me, a reminder that I'd been part of something strong, something lasting. These small acts gave me courage, but the loneliness still pressed in, especially at night. I'd lie awake listening to the house creak and feel the weight of my isolation. I missed Thomas's warmth beside me, his quiet reassurances. I missed Caroline, not the woman she'd become, but the girl who'd clung to me during thunderstorms, who'd begged for one more bedtime story. I wondered where that girl had gone and whether I'd failed her somehow. The shame still lingered, a stubborn stain I couldn't scrub away. I hadn't told anyone the full truth, not Mrs. Larson, not my sister, not even myself in the mirror. How could I admit that my daughter wanted me out of her life? It felt like confessing a sin I didn't commit. But one day something shifted. It was a Saturday and I'd gone to the park as usual. Mrs. Larson wasn't there. She'd mentioned a doctor's appointment, so I sat alone watching the ducks glide across the pond. A young woman approached, pushing a stroller, and smiled at me. "Nice day, isn't it?" she said, her voice bright. I nodded, surprised by the warmth in her eyes. She sat nearby, cooing to her baby, and we fell into an easy conversation about the weather, her child, the way the park hadn't changed in years. Her name was Sarah, and she lived a few streets over. She didn't know my story, didn't need to. She just talked to me like I was someone worth talking to. When she left, she said, "See you around, Eleanor," and the sound of my name in her voice felt like a gift. That encounter, small as it was, lit something in me. I walked home with a lightness I hadn't felt in weeks. When I passed the garden, I noticed the roses were wilting, neglected by Mark's so-called landscapers. I grabbed my shears and spent the afternoon pruning my hands, remembering the rhythm Thomas had taught me. The work was hard, my back aching, but it felt good, purposeful. Caroline came home as I was finishing her car, pulling into the driveway. She glanced at the garden, then at me, her expression unreadable. "You don't need to do that, Mom," she said, her tone flat. I looked at her, my hands stained with dirt, and said I wanted to. It was the first time I'd spoken back, not sharply, but firmly. She blinked, then walked inside without another word. It wasn't a victory, but it was something, a line drawn, however faint. That night, I did something I hadn't done in years. I pulled out my old journal, a leather-bound book Thomas had given me when Caroline was born. Its pages were mostly empty. I'd been too busy living to write, but I felt an urge to put words to what was happening. I wrote about Caroline's words, the house, the park, Mrs. Larson, Sarah. I wrote about Thomas, about the woman I'd been with him, and the woman I was trying to become again. The act of writing felt like a conversation with myself, a way to make sense of the pain and the hope tangled inside me. I filled 3 pages, my handwriting shaky but sure. And when I closed the journal, I felt lighter, like I'd set down a heavy load. The next morning, I went to the park again. Mrs. Larson was back, and we talked longer than usual. I told her about the roses, about my journal, and she smiled, her eyes crinkling. "You're finding your way, Eleanor," she said, bit by bit. She invited me to her house for tea the next day, a small gesture that felt monumental. I accepted, my heart swelling with gratitude. As I walked home, I passed the bakery Sarah had mentioned, and on impulse, I went inside. The smell of fresh bread wrapped around me, and I bought a loaf, imagining sharing it with Mrs. Larson. It was a small thing, but it felt like a step toward something new, a life where I wasn't just surviving, but living. Back at the house, Caroline and Mark were arguing in the living room, their voices sharp. I didn't linger to listen. I went to my room, set the bread on my dresser, and picked up Thomas's carving knife. I held it, feeling its weight, and thought of the roses, the journal, the park. I was still here, Eleanor, and I was starting to remember what that meant. The road ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in months, I felt a quiet strength growing like a river, carving its way through stone. I didn't know where it would take me, but I was ready to find out. The air in the house seemed to shift as summer crept in, though the tension between Caroline, Mark, and me remained a constant undercurrent, like a river running beneath ice. Their disregard no longer surprised me, but it still stung, each dismissive glance, each plan made without me a reminder of my place in their world. Yet something within me was changing, growing stronger with every morning at the park. Every page I filled in my journal, every small act of defiance I claimed. I was no longer just surviving their rejection. I was beginning to rebuild quietly, deliberately, like a gardener tending a neglected plot. The woman I'd been with Thomas, resilient, purposeful, was stirring again. And though she was still fragile, she was real. My mornings with Mrs. Larson became a ritual, a sacred hour where I could breathe without the weight of Caroline's words. Her small house filled with faded photos, and the scent of lavender felt like a haven. Over tea, she'd share stories of her life, some joyful, some laced with loss, and I began to open up in return. I told her about the attic, the carving knife, the roses I'd saved. I even told her about Caroline's demand that I leave, though the words tasted bitter. She listened without judgment, her hands folded around her teacup, and when I finished, she said, "Eleanor, you've carried so much, but you're not done carrying yourself." Her words were a mirror showing me a strength I'd forgotten I had. I left her house each time with a little more resolve, a little more of myself reclaimed. One afternoon after tea with Mrs. Larson, I stopped by the local library on a whim. I hadn't been there in years, not since Caroline was young, and I'd read her stories under the big oak table. The library was quiet, its shelves a comforting maze of possibilities. I wandered to the gardening section drawn by memories of my roses and found a book on heirloom plants. I checked it out, along with a worn copy of a poetry collection Thomas used to love. At home, I sat in my rocking chair by the window and read the words of poets and gardeners, weaving a thread of connection to the woman I'd been. I started sketching plans for the garden in my journal, not just roses, but lavender daisies, things that would bloom long after I was gone. It was a quiet act, but it felt like planting a flag in my own life. Caroline noticed the changes, though. She didn't say much. She'd catch me reading or writing and pause her brow furrowing as if she couldn't quite place me. Once she saw the gardening book on the table and said, "Mom, you're not still fussing with the yard, are you? We're getting professionals." I looked at her, my voice steady, and said, "It's my garden, Caroline. I'll tend it." She blinked, startled, then walked away. It wasn't a fight, but it was a boundary, and it felt like victory. Mark, on the other hand, grew bolder in his disdain. "Eleanor, you're wasting your time," he'd say, gesturing to my books or the dirt under my nails. "Let us handle things." I stopped responding, letting his words fall like leaves I'd sweep away later. Their dismissal no longer defined me. I was defining myself. One evening, I made a decision that felt both daring and inevitable. I'd been thinking about the house, about the deed Thomas and I had signed decades ago. It was in my name, Thomas had insisted, saying it was my home as much as his. Caroline and Mark didn't know or didn't care, assuming their presence gave them ownership. I hadn't touched the paperwork since Thomas's death, but now I felt a need to see it, to hold it. I waited until they were out, then went to the small safe in my bedroom closet hidden behind winter coats. My hands trembled as I dialed the combination, the click of the lock loud in the silence. Inside was the deed, yellowed but intact, along with our marriage certificate and a letter Thomas had written me before he died. I didn't read the letter, I wasn't ready, but I held the deed, my fingers tracing our names. It was proof of what we'd built, proof that this was mine. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in my rocking chair, the deed on my lap, and thought about what it meant. Not just the house, but my life, my worth. I'd spent years giving time, love, energy, and I'd let Caroline and Mark take it for granted. But holding that deed, I realized I had power choices, a voice I'd silenced too long. I didn't know what I'd do with it yet, but the knowledge was enough to shift something inside me. I felt like a woman waking from a long sleep, blinking into the light, remembering who she was. The next day, I took another step. Mrs. Larson had mentioned a community gardening group that met at the library, and I decided to go. I was nervous, my hands fidgeting as I walked in, but the group, mostly women my age or older, was welcoming. They shared tips on soil and seeds, laughed over failed crops, and listened when I talked about my roses. One woman, Clara, invited me to visit her garden, saying we old gardeners have to stick together. I laughed, the sound surprising me, and accepted. For the first time in months, I felt part of something connected to people who saw me not as a burden, but as a person with something to offer. Back home, I started spending more time in the garden, not just pruning, but planting lavender along the fence daisies by the porch. The work was hard, my knees aching, but it was mine. One afternoon, Sarah, the young mother from the park, stopped by with her baby. She'd seen me working and brought a thermos of lemonade. We sat on the porch talking about her daughter, My Garden, the way life surprises you. She called me Miss Eleanor, and the respect in her voice warmed me like sunlight. When she left, she said, "You've got a gift with those flowers, Miss Eleanor. Don't let anyone tell you different." I smiled my heart full and watched her go. That evening, I did something symbolic, something for me. I took Thomas's carving knife and went to the backyard where a small apple tree stood, one we'd planted when Caroline was born. It had grown crooked, neglected, but it was still there. I carved my initials EM into the bark, small but clear. It wasn't about ownership or anger. It was about claiming my place, my story. I stood back, the knife heavy in my hand, and felt a quiet pride. This was my home, my life, and I was done letting others erase me. Caroline and Mark noticed the garden's transformation, but said little. Mark muttered about wasted effort, but I didn't care. I was building something not for them, but for myself. I kept writing in my journal, the pages filling with plans, memories, dreams I hadn't dared to dream in years. I wrote about the deed, about the power it gave me, and about the woman I was becoming. Each word was a step, each choice, a brick in the foundation of a new Eleanor. I didn't know where this path would lead, but I was walking it one deliberate step at a time, and that was enough. The summer deepened, and with it, the quiet strength I'd been nurturing began to take root, steady and unyielding, like the lavender I'd planted along the fence. The house remained a place of strained silences and sharp edges, with Caroline and Mark moving through it as if I were a piece of furniture they'd grown tired of dusting. Their disregard no longer cut as deeply, though. I was learning to shield myself not with anger, but with purpose. Each morning, I'd wake before dawn, slip into the garden and tend to my plants, roses, daisies, lavender, my hands steady in the cool earth. The work was a prayer, a way of saying, I am still here, still Eleanor. The pain of Caroline's words, old and bitter, hadn't vanished, but it was no longer the loudest voice in my heart. I was finding my own. My time with Mrs. Larson and the gardening group grew into a lifeline, a reminder that I wasn't as alone as I'd felt. Mrs. Larson's house, with its chipped teacups and stories, was a refuge where I could speak my truth without fear. I told her more about Caroline and Mark, about the deed I'd found, about the carving in the apple tree. She listened, her eyes kind but fierce, and said, "Eleanor, you're not just holding on, you're building something new." Her words echoed in me, urging me forward. The gardening group, too, became a source of strength. Clara, the woman who'd invited me to her garden, had a laugh that filled the room, and she'd tease me about my fancy roses while sharing her own tricks for growing herbs. These women, most in their 60s and 70s, carried their own losses, widowed, estranged, overlooked, but they didn't let it define them. They were vibrant, stubborn, alive, and being with them made me feel the same. One afternoon, Clara invited me to a local farmer's market where the group was selling seedlings to raise money for a community garden. I hesitated. I hadn't done anything like that in years, but she insisted, saying, "Eleanor, your roses deserve a stage." So I went, bringing a few potted clippings from my garden. The market was alive with color, and sound vendors calling out children, running the smell of fresh bread in the air. I stood at our booth, nervous at first, but as people stopped to admire my roses, I found myself talking easily, sharing stories of how Thomas and I had planted them. A young couple bought a pot, saying they'd name the plant after me, and an older man told me my roses reminded him of his mother's garden. For the first time in months, I felt useful, valued, not for what I'd been, but for what I was doing now. The market sparked something in me, a desire to do more, to step further into the world. I started volunteering with the gardening group, helping plan the community plot they were building. I'd spend afternoons at the library researching native plants, sketching layouts, my journal filling with ideas. I even began teaching a few of the younger members how to prune properly, my voice steady, as I showed them what Thomas had taught me. These moments, small as they were bricks in the wall of my new life. I wasn't just reclaiming my past. I was creating a future one where I wasn't defined by Caroline's rejection or Mark's disdain. At home, the tension simmered. Caroline and Mark were moving forward with their plans to update the house, bringing in contractors to measure the kitchen, talking about tearing out the fireplace Thomas had built. They didn't ask my opinion, and I didn't offer it. I'd learned to pick my battles, saving my energy for what mattered. But one evening, Mark crossed a line. I was in the garden watering the lavender when he came out, a beer in hand, and said, "Eleanor, this is getting ridiculous. You're out here playing farmer while we're trying to make this place functional. Why don't you just let it go?" His tone was mocking, his eyes cold. I set down the watering can, looked at him, and said, "This is my home, Mark. I'll tend it how I see fit." My voice didn't waver, and for once he didn't have a comeback. He walked away muttering, but I felt a surge of pride. I wasn't invisible anymore. That night, I went back to the safe in my closet and took out the deed again. I sat in my rocking chair holding it, the paper heavy with possibility. I thought about what it represented, not just the house, but my choices, my power. I'd been thinking about Caroline's ex-husband, David, a kind man who'd always treated me with respect even after their divorce. He'd visit now and then, bringing Caroline's old photos or asking about my garden, and I'd seen the sadness in his eyes when he spoke of her. I wondered where he was now, what he'd think of all this. The idea of the deed, of what I could do with it, began to take shape in my mind, not out of spite, but out of a need to honor myself. I tucked the deed away, not ready to act, but feeling its weight, its promise. The next day, I did something bold. I'd been saving a little money, small amounts from Thomas's pension tucked away in a separate account Caroline and Mark didn't know about. I went to a local nursery and bought a flat of seedlings marigolds, bright and defiant. I planted them along the front walk where everyone could see. It was a statement, a burst of color that said, "Eleanor is here." Sarah, the young mother from the park, saw them when she passed by with her stroller. She stopped, her face lighting up, and said, "Miss Eleanor, this place looks alive again." We talked for a while, and she told me she'd started a small garden of her own inspired by mine. Her words warmed me, a reminder that my choices rippled outward, touching lives I hadn't expected. I began to see my value in new ways, not just as a mother or wife, but as a woman with something to give. I joined a book club at the library, suggested by Clara, and found myself debating poetry and novels with women who challenged and delighted me. I started baking again, not for Caroline or Mark, but for the gardening group, bringing loaves of bread to our meetings. Each act, each connection was a thread in the tapestry of my new life. I wrote about it all in my journal, the pages now thick with my thoughts, my plans, my dreams. I wrote about the deed, about David, about the possibility of a choice that would change everything. The words were a map guiding me towards something I couldn't yet name. One evening, as I sat in the garden watching the marigolds glow in the dusk, I felt a peace I hadn't known in years. The house loomed behind me, its windows dark, but I wasn't afraid of it anymore. I thought of Thomas, of the life we'd built, and of the woman I was becoming. I took out his carving knife, which I'd started carrying in my pocket, and held it, its weight grounding me. I didn't need to carve anything new. The act of holding it was enough. I was reclaiming my dignity, not with loud gestures, but with quiet, deliberate choices. I didn't know what lay ahead, but I knew I was ready to stand, to choose to be Eleanor in a way I hadn't been in years. The summer stretched into long, golden days, and with each one I felt myself growing taller, not in body, but in spirit, as if I were a tree reaching for light after years in shadow. The house remained a place of cold distance, with Caroline and Mark's voices echoing through it like strangers planning renovations, dismissing my presence, acting as if the home Thomas and I built was theirs to reshape. Their indifference no longer broke me, though. I'd built a quiet armor forged from the mornings, with Mrs. Larson, the afternoons with the gardening group, the evenings spent writing in my journal. Caroline's words, old and bitter, still lingered, but they were like distant thunder, no longer shaking the ground beneath me. I was finding my footing step by steady step, and it felt like coming home to myself. My garden became my sanctuary, a living testament to my resilience. The marigolds along the walk blazed bright. The lavender filled the air with its soft scent, and my roses bloomed fuller than they had in years. I'd spend hours there, weeding, planting, pruning my hands caked with earth, my heart steady with purpose. Neighbors began to notice. Sarah, the young mother, would wave from the sidewalk, her baby giggling in the stroller, and call out, "Miss Eleanor, your garden's the prettiest on the street." An older couple down the road stopped by one day asking for tips on their own flowers, and I found myself teaching them what Thomas had taught me. My voice, sure and warm, these moments, small as they were, reminded me that I had something to give, something the world still wanted. The gardening group grew into more than a hobby. It was a community, a place where I was seen and valued. Clara and the others treated me not as a relic, but as a woman with ideas, skills, a story. We worked together on the community garden breaking ground on a plot behind the library. I threw myself into it, hauling soil, planting seeds, laughing with the others over muddy boots and stubborn weeds. One day, Clara handed me a trowel and said, "Eleanor, you're the heart of this project. Don't let anyone tell you different." Her words sank deep, filling cracks I hadn't realized were there. I started leading small workshops for the group, teaching pruning techniques and sharing stories of my garden with Thomas. The younger members listened, their eyes bright, and I felt a pride I hadn't known in years, not just in what I'd done, but in who I was becoming. At home, the rift with Caroline and Mark widened, though I no longer sought their approval. They pressed forward with their plans to modernize the house, bringing in architects who measured walls and sketched designs without a glance at me. I overheard them talking about selling parts of the property, about how it's time to move forward. Each word was a reminder of their assumption that I was irrelevant, a footnote in their story. But I held the deed in my mind, its existence, a quiet power I wasn't ready to reveal. I'd taken to checking it regularly, slipping into my closet to open the safe not out of doubt, but to remind myself of what was mine. The paper, worn but clear, was a promise to Thomas, to myself, that I wouldn't let our life be erased. One morning, I made a decision that felt both practical and profound. I contacted a lawyer, a woman Mrs. Larson had recommended, to review the deed and my options. I didn't tell anyone, not even Mrs. Larson. I drove to the lawyer's office, a small building downtown, my heart pounding but my hands steady. The lawyer, Ms. Thompson, was in her 50s with sharp eyes and a kind voice. She read the deed, asked about my situation, and listened as I spoke haltingly at first, then with growing clarity about Caroline, Mark, and the house. I didn't tell her everything, but enough for her to understand. "Eleanor," she said, leaning forward, "this deed gives you control. You have choices more than you might think." She outlined possibilities, keeping the house, selling it, transferring it. She didn't push, but her words lit a fire in me. I left with a folder of papers and a sense of agency I hadn't felt in years. That afternoon, I did something symbolic, something for my soul. I took Thomas's carving knife and went to the garden where the apple tree stood, its bark still marked with my initials. I carved a small heart beside them, simple but deliberate, a nod to the love that had built this life and the love I was finding for myself. As I worked, I thought of David Caroline's ex-husband. I'd seen him a few months back at a grocery store, and we'd talked briefly. He'd asked about my garden, listened with genuine interest, and said, "You're the heart of that house, Eleanor." His kindness had stayed with me, a contrast to Mark's cruelty. I wondered if he'd meant it, if he'd understand what I was considering. The idea of the deed, of transferring it to him, was taking shape not as revenge, but as justice, a way to honor what was right. I began to act with more intention, not just in the garden, but in my life. I opened a new bank account separate from the one Caroline and Mark knew about and started moving small amounts of money into it, pension checks, savings I'd kept hidden. It wasn't much, but it was mine, a safety net for whatever came next. I joined more activities at the library, poetry readings, a writing group, where I shared pieces from my journal. The other writers, a mix of ages, praised my words, saying they felt alive, honest. I started to see myself through their eyes, not as old or bitter, but as a woman with a story worth telling. I wrote about the house, the deed, the apple tree, and the choice I was circling. Each word was a step toward clarity, a way of claiming my voice. One evening, Sarah invited me to her house for dinner. I hesitated. Caroline and Mark were home, and I didn't want questions, but I went. Sarah's home was small, cluttered with toys, alive with her daughter's laughter. We ate spaghetti, talked about gardening and motherhood, and for a few hours I felt like part of a family again. Sarah's husband, a quiet man, thanked me for inspiring Sarah's garden, and I nearly cried. As I left, Sarah hugged me and said, "Miss Eleanor, you're like the grandma I wish I had." Her words wrapped around me a warmth I carried home. Back at the house, I found Caroline and Mark arguing in the living room, their voices sharp over money, the house, their plans. I slipped upstairs unnoticed and sat in my rocking chair. I took out my journal and wrote about Sarah, about the lawyer, about the heart in the apple tree. I wrote about David, about the deed, about the woman I was becoming, someone who could choose, who could act, who could stand tall. The house was quiet, but it seemed to hum with the life I was building inside and out. I didn't know when or how I'd make my choice, but I knew it was coming, steady as the season, strong as the roots I'd planted. I closed my journal, held Thomas's knife, and felt ready not for revenge, but for truth, for the dignity I'd earned. The air in late summer carried a weight heavy with heat and the promise of change, and I felt it in my bones as I moved through my days with a clarity I hadn't known in years. The house, once my sanctuary, then my cage, was now a stage one, where the truth I'd been holding was about to unfold. Caroline and Mark's presence remained a constant pressure, their plans for the house growing louder, more insistent. They spoke of selling the back acre, of gutting the kitchen, of turning my home into something sleek and unrecognizable, as if Thomas's hands had never touched the beams, as if my life here was a footnote they could erase. But I was no longer the woman who shrank from their dismissal. I'd grown strong, not in loud defiance, but in quiet, deliberate choices, and the deed in my safe was a truth I was ready to wield, not to wound, but to reclaim what was mine. My mornings with Mrs. Larson, my afternoons with the gardening group, and my evenings writing in my journal had built a foundation, one that held me steady as I prepared for what was coming. I'd met with Ms. Thompson, the lawyer, again, and we'd gone over every detail of the deed, every option. She'd looked at me, her eyes steady, and said, "Eleanor, whatever you choose, it's yours to decide. No one can take that from you." Her words were a torch, lighting the path I'd been circling. I'd thought of David Caroline's ex-husband more and more, his kindness, his respect, the way he'd always seen me as more than a mother-in-law. I tracked him down through a mutual friend and called him my voice, shaking, but sure. We met at a coffee shop, and I told him everything, Caroline's words, Mark's cruelty, the deed. He listened, his face a mix of sadness and anger, and said, "Eleanor, you deserve better than this." When I told him my plan, his eyes widened, but he nodded, saying, "If you're sure, I'll honor it." That was all I needed. The day I chose arrived quietly, a Saturday in August, the air thick with the scent of my lavender. Caroline and Mark had planned a family meeting, not with me, but with Mark's parents, and a realtor to discuss next steps for the house. They'd told me to stay upstairs, saying it was business, not personal. I nodded, letting them think I'd comply, but I had other plans. I'd spent the week preparing meeting with Ms. Thompson to finalize the paperwork, calling David to confirm his role. I'd even told Mrs. Larson, who'd squeezed my hand and said, "You're doing right, Eleanor, for you." That morning, I dressed carefully, my best blouse, a scarf. Thomas had loved, my hair pulled back with a clip Caroline had given me as a child. I looked in the mirror and saw a woman who'd earned her strength who was ready to stand. The meeting was in the dining room, the table covered with blueprints and contracts. I waited upstairs listening to the murmur of voices, Mark's loud confidence, Caroline's clipped agreement, the realtor's smooth pitch. I held the folder Ms. Thompson had given me the deed and its transfer papers inside, and felt Thomas's carving knife in my pocket, a talisman of my resolve. When I heard Mark say, "We'll have the place cleared out by fall," I knew it was time. I walked downstairs, my steps slow but steady, and entered the room. The conversation stopped, all eyes on me. Mark's annoyed, Caroline's impatient, the realtor's confused, Mark's parents polite but distant. I didn't flinch. I set the folder on the table and said, "I have something to say." Caroline sighed. "Mom, this isn't the time." But I held up a hand, my voice calm but firm. "It's exactly the time, Caroline. This is my home, and I've let you treat it and me like it isn't. That ends now." I opened the folder, pulled out the deed, and laid it on the table. "This is the deed to the house. It's in my name, as it has been, since Thomas and I built it. You've made plans without me assumed I'd step aside, but you were wrong." The room was silent, the air thick with shock. Mark started to speak, but I cut him off, my eyes on Caroline. "You called me old and bitter, told me to leave. You forgot who I am, what I've given you. But I haven't forgotten." I took a breath, my heart pounding, but my voice steady. "I've made a choice. I've transferred the deed to someone who respects this house, who respects me. As of yesterday, this house belongs to David." Caroline's face went pale, her mouth opening but no words coming. Mark sputtered, "You can't do that." But I held up the transfer papers signed and notarized. "I already have. David will decide what happens next. He's on his way now." The realtor looked stunned, Mark's parents uncomfortable, but I felt only calm, a deep-rooted peace. I'd chosen not to destroy, but to honor myself, Thomas, the life we'd built. David arrived minutes later, stepping into the room with a quiet dignity. He nodded to me, his eyes warm with understanding, and said, "Eleanor, I'll take care of it." Caroline stared at him, then at me, her face a mix of disbelief and anger. "Mom, how could you?" she whispered, her voice breaking. I looked at her, my daughter, and felt a pang of sorrow but no regret. "You made your choices, Caroline," I said softly. "I made mine." I didn't raise my voice, didn't need to. My dignity, my truth, was enough. Mark tried to argue, but David cut him off, saying, "This is legal. It's done." The realtor gathered her papers. Mark's parents murmured excuses, and the meeting dissolved, their plans crumbling like dry leaves. I walked out to the garden, leaving them to their shock, and sat by the apple tree, my fingers tracing the heart I'd carved. David joined me later, sitting quietly. "I'll keep the house as it is, Eleanor," he said. "It's yours, as long as you want it." I nodded, tears in my eyes, not for loss, but for the freedom I'd claimed. I'd silenced their dismissal, not with rage, but with truth, and it was enough. The house stood behind us, its windows catching the light, and I felt Thomas with me, proud, steady, whole. The days after the meeting felt like the quiet after a storm, still almost fragile, but filled with a clarity that settled deep in my soul. The house, my home, stood, as it always had, its white walls and black shutters catching the late summer light. But it felt different now, as if it had exhaled alongside me. Caroline and Mark moved out within a week, their belongings packed in a flurry of tense silences and averted eyes. I didn't watch them go. I was in the garden tending my roses when their car pulled away, the sound of gravel under their tires fading into the distance. I didn't feel triumph, nor did I feel loss. What I felt was peace, a steady rhythm in my heart that said, I'd done what was right, not for revenge, but for myself, for the woman I'd fought to become. David kept his word. He owned the house now on paper, but he treated it as mine, insisting I stay as long as I wished. He'd stop by sometimes bringing coffee or a book he thought I'd like, and we'd sit on the porch talking about small things, the weather, my garden, his work. He never asked for details about Caroline, and I didn't offer them. There was an understanding between us, a quiet respect that needed no words. He'd look at the roses, the marigolds, the lavender, and say, "Eleanor, you've made this place a home again." His words were a gift, not because I needed his approval, but because they echoed the truth I'd found within myself. This was my home, not because of a deed or a name, but because I'd chosen to honor it to honor me. Caroline called once a few weeks later. Her voice was tight, hesitant, as if she wasn't sure what she wanted to say. "Mom, I didn't mean for it to go like this," she said. I listened, my heart aching for the girl she'd been, but I didn't soften. "Caroline, I said you made choices. So did I. I hope you find what you're looking for." I didn't forgive her, not yet, and I didn't need to. Forgiveness wasn't the point. Peace was, and I had it. She didn't call again, and I let the silence be. If she came back one day ready to see me, to really see me, I'd be here. But I wasn't waiting for her anymore. I was living for myself. The garden became my joy, a canvas where I painted my days. I planted more sunflowers that stretched toward the sky herbs that scented the air, a small patch of wildflowers for the bees. The gardening group helped their laughter and muddy hands a constant delight. Clara and I started a seed-sharing program passing out packets at the farmer's market, and Sarah joined us, her daughter, toddling through the rows, giggling at butterflies. Mrs. Larson came too, her limp slower now, but her spirit bright. "You've bloomed, Eleanor," she said one day, her eyes crinkling. I smiled, knowing she was right. I wasn't just tending plants, I was tending my life, and it was growing vibrant and full. I kept writing in my journal, the pages now, a tapestry of my journey, grief, strength, choices, peace. I shared some of it with the library's writing group, reading aloud in a voice that no longer trembled. They listened, their nods and quiet tears, telling me my story mattered. I wrote about Thomas, about the house, about the deed, and David, about the woman who'd carved her initials in an apple tree and found her way back to herself. I wrote for me, but also for others, for every woman who'd been told she was too old, too bitter, too much, or not enough. I wanted them to know they could choose, could stand tall, could bloom. One afternoon I did something I'd been planning for months. I went to the backyard to the apple tree where my initials and heart were carved and planted a single daisy at its base. It was small, its white petals delicate but stubborn, like me. I knelt in the dirt, my hands pressing the soil, and spoke to Thomas, not in words, but in the quiet of my heart. I thanked him for the life we'd built, for the love that still held me, for the strength he'd always seen in me. The daisy was my offering not to him alone, but to us, to the past that had shaped me, and the future I was shaping now. I stood brushing dirt from my knees and felt whole, not because I'd won, but because I'd chosen myself. Now, as I sit here telling you this story, I think of you. Yes, you listening, maybe feeling like you've been overlooked, dismissed, told your time has passed. I want you to know something. Something I learned in the hardest way. Your worth isn't measured by who accepts you, but by how you choose to honor yourself. You are not old or bitter or done. You are a garden waiting for your hands to tend it. Plant something, even if it's small, a flower, a word, a choice. Let it grow. Let it be yours. I still live in this house, my home surrounded by my garden and the life I've built. Mrs. Larson visits Sarah's daughter, leaves tiny handprints in the dirt, and David's laughter fills the porch some evenings. The roses bloom, the daisy by the apple tree thrives, and I am at peace. I keep Thomas's carving knife on my nightstand, not as a weapon, but as a reminder of the woman I was. I am the woman I'll always be. And every day I choose to live, to love, to be Eleanor, with grace and strength and a heart that's learned to bloom again.